Good afternoon and welcome to CCK Live with Chisholm and Kilpatrick. I'm Courtney Ross and I'm joined today by Nick Briggs and Rachel Foster. And today we are going to be talking about tips for your VA buddy letter. So let's jump in with, I think, kind of the basics. Rachel, can you tell us what exactly we mean when we say a buddy letter? What is a buddy letter?
Sure, Courtney. So, a VA buddy letter, also known as a lay statement or lay evidence, is a credible statement in support of a claim for VA disability benefits. A statement can serve as a valuable piece of evidence in your VA claim. So, just for some examples, buddy statements are important and can be used to fill in gaps of information missing from treatment records or service records. They can also serve as a witness statement for an event, injury, or illness in service, and they can be particularly useful for corroboration. They can also provide clarification and better illustrate the veteran's current situation and how their disabilities impact their daily life. Essentially, they can be used to help support a claim for service connection or an increased evaluation.
Thanks, Rachel. So it sounds to me like these could be a really important piece of evidence in a veteran's case. Nick, can you talk a little bit about the importance of these letters and how it might impact?
So lay statements are important largely because they're evidence in the same way that medical evidence is evidence, meaning that the board and the VA need to consider lay statements provided by the veteran and people who know the veteran. The important piece of information, which we'll touch on a bit later, is the idea of competency, meaning that the statement can't just be from anyone. It needs to be from someone with sufficient personal knowledge of the thing that they're testifying to, be it how the veteran's conditions affect them on a day-to-day basis, or somebody who specifically witnessed an incident that the veteran experienced in service. So long as there's some level of personal knowledge of the thing that they're reporting, that's evidence that VA needs to consider when adjudicating a veteran's claim. And although lay evidence isn't as important as medical evidence, depending on the question, it's still something that needs to be considered. When it comes to competency, obviously a veteran can say certain things and they can't say certain things. For example, they can't attribute a specific symptom to a specific medical diagnosis. That's something a doctor needs to do. But as long as they're testifying to something or the buddy is testifying to something that they have personal knowledge of and have the knowledge to speak to, it's something that VA needs to consider before they can deny the issue.
What might we include in these letters if a veteran or a buddy of a veteran was submitting a letter to VA? I think the answer depends on what you're trying to prove to VA. So, what kind of claim you have pending. Buddy letters can speak to the impact of a physical or mental condition on the veteran's day to day life. It could also speak to an injury, an event, or symptoms in service that they witnessed. So the content will really depend on what exactly the veteran has pending and what they're trying to establish to VA. For example, if they are trying to corroborate an in service event or an injury, and they can obtain a buddy statement from a service member. To Nick's point, the statement should include information about why the individual has personal knowledge about the event. And then they'll want to include some details about the event. So a detailed description of what they witnessed, if they were involved in the event, when and where the event or the injury occurred in service. If the statement is going to be more focused on the symptoms of a veteran's condition and how it's impacted their day-to-day life, some information you might want to include is how the veteran's impacted by their condition, what the person's able to witness, how the veteran has changed since service, and how they've noticed, how the condition has become more severe. And if they're aware of any treatment the veteran is getting for their condition, maybe increased treatment compared to a few years ago. Anything that the person's able to witness and have that personal knowledge about is the types of details that you want to include in a buddy letter or statement that you are submitting to VA. So with that said, Rachel, how would you suggest that people organize a buddy letter or structure it, given that there might be a variety of information they want to include in the letter?
We would recommend that buddy letters be organized into four main sections that are structured in a particular order. So to start with, you always want to make sure that the name is included, the contact information of who's providing the information, and how you know the veteran. If you've served with the veteran and you're corroborating an in-service stressor, it's also important to include the details of that, including the unit assigned. The second thing you want to make sure, of course, is the detail that you mentioned, Courtney, what you witnessed in the past or what you are currently witnessing. And third, you want to also describe, especially if you're including information about the veteran's current limitations, you want to describe the veteran's current symptoms of their disabilities. And also, last but not least, you want to make sure that you're signing and dating the statement, essentially certifying that you are providing this information to the best of your knowledge and belief.
We've kind of provided some information on what to include in the letters, how to structure them. So my next question is, who can actually write these letters? Who can veterans reach out to provide some of this information? I mentioned service members, other service members that the veteran served with might be able to provide some information on in-service events or injuries. But Nick, what are some other examples of individuals that veterans might ask to provide buddy letters to VA?
Again, the key question comes down to what it is that you're trying to get or provide information on. And in providing that information, it's got to be somebody who has personal knowledge of the thing that they're reporting. Again, we talk about the idea of competency, which we'll get into. But as long as it's a competent individual who's 18 years old and has direct firsthand knowledge of the event, they can describe what they saw, how they experienced it. So when it comes down to who can provide that, it's anybody who meets that criteria. It could be a fellow service member, it could be a spouse, a friend, a coworker, in the case of TDIU appeals. It can be an adult child who helps their parents with the activities of daily living because of how their conditions affect them, or any other witness that has personal firsthand knowledge of the incident. And at the end of the day, a veteran can still write a statement on their own behalf. There are certain subjective things like pain that nobody else can really speak to other than the veteran themselves. So they're ultimately going to be the most competent to describe specific aspects of their condition, and should always feel free to submit statements to that end.
I think that's a really great point, Nick, and reminds me too that you can also get more than just one buddy statement or one buddy letter that you're submitting to VA. So maybe there's multiple people in your life that have that personal knowledge Nick has been talking about in terms of observing your symptoms, or there's multiple individuals that you served with who can speak to your injury in service, especially if you're trying to corroborate something like a stressor to get a grant of service connection for PTSD. Consider multiple people that you might be able to reach out to. There's no limit on how many buddy statements that you could submit. With that said, and we're going to talk about this later in the presentation, the more that you submit, the more potential there might be for some inconsistency, which can cause some issues. But I won't jump ahead just yet. We're going to cover that in a little bit more detail. So if you do have or you want to submit a buddy letter, how do you go about doing so? VA doesn't require any specific form or format to submit a buddy letter or statement on. So you could, draft up a Word document or write a handwritten letter, and VA needs to accept it. But with that said, VA also does have some forms that an individual who's providing a buddy letter can use to provide the information. One of them is VA Form 214138, which is the VA's form for a statement in support of a claim. And one thing to keep in mind is that VA fairly consistently updates forms and creates new forms. And so that there might be we're expecting a new updated form early next year as well, that's going to be available to provide lay witness statements on as well. The other one, and this form is specific for PTSD cases, is VA Form 210781. And this is specific for statements in support of claims for service connection for PTSD. And again, you don't have to use these forms, but they are available on VA's website. And it might be easier if a veteran's asking someone to provide a statement to provide the form to them as well, so that individual kind of can go through the form and fill in the information there. I would also suggest not using the form for more than one statement. So if you are going to get multiple buddy letters or statements to submit to VA, you want to have the individual do it on separate forms if you are going to use the forms that VA provide. So generally speaking, Rachel, what are some tips that you would provide to people who are seeking buddy letters? What are just some general helpful tips for things to keep in mind if they are going to obtain one of these to submit to VA?
As you and Nick had mentioned earlier, competency and credibility are very important when we're talking about creating these buddy letters. So, in order for VA to consider late evidence, it must be deemed both competent and credible. So, when we're talking about competency, we're really referring, as Nick described earlier, to the firsthand knowledge of the individual completing the statement, meaning that anyone who prepares a lay statement for a veteran must have personal knowledge of what is being discussed, and also whether they have the knowledge base to discuss it. So, they wouldn't be able to offer a medical opinion if they don't have the credentials of a physician or a medical provider. So credibility speaks to the reliability of what is being said in a statement. A statement can be deemed reliable if it's essentially consistent with the record. Another tip, this one we've said before, but it's very important and it can easily be left off once the body of the statement is completed, is always sign and date the document. Those writing lay statements for a veteran should always sign and date and indicate how they have this personal knowledge about the veteran's information and the relationship to the veteran. Following these steps will help to ensure that VA finds the statement credible. For example, a spouse completing a lay statement for a veteran's claim should mention the length of time they have been married and or living together to further reinforce and support their ability to talk and discuss about the veteran's symptoms, limitations, or what it is that they are witnessing.
Thanks, Rachel. I agree. I think those are two really helpful tips. And as you said, are things we've kind of been echoing throughout this presentation as well, because of how important they are to keep in mind. Nick, do you have any additional tips that you would offer as well?
First and foremost, try and keep it concise. You really don't want a statement that's 3, 4, 5 pages long when it could be a page or less. We really want to focus in on the specific facts and details of what's being reported more than some of the other stuff that might make it too long and distract VA from the point, which is what you're trying to show or corroborate with the lay evidence. You also want to include your contact information, phone number, address, or email. That way, if VA has any additional questions about what you're talking about, they can reach back out to you for clarification. Another thing that kind of seems obvious is including the veteran's name. Especially with fellow service members and family members, we often see people using nicknames or pet names for friends that don't necessarily specifically identify who they're talking about. So being very clear with the veteran's full name can be helpful to make sure that VA doesn't think you're talking about somebody else. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you close the statement with something along the lines of, I certify that my statements are true and correct to the best of my knowledge and belief. This is really just an affirmation, again, that the person providing the statement is attesting to their firsthand knowledge to the best that they can recall.
Thanks, Nick. I think those are all really helpful tips and really important things for individuals to keep in mind as well when they're drafting a buddy letter to VA. I want to circle back to something I mentioned earlier about potential common mistakes to avoid for anyone writing a buddy letter, specifically keeping in mind that inconsistencies in the information that a veteran is reporting in a statement, or when they've received treatment at VA previously, inconsistency with that information and information that someone's providing in a buddy letter could cause potential problems with credibility, which, as I said, is something we've a theme throughout what we're talking about here today. And so some things you can do to help avoid that becoming a problem is, I'm going to use the example of a statement. You're getting a buddy lay statement where you're trying to corroborate an in-service event, let's say for service connection for PTSD. So it's very likely the veteran has already provided some detailed information or will be providing some detailed information as to what happened to them in service. You want to make sure that buddy statement has information that isn't going to be different than what the veterans reported about the event. And so something you can keep in mind is details about the event is important, but things like the timing of it you might want to keep it more vague in the letter so that the veteran doesn't say it happened in, April 21st, 1973, and then the buddy statement says it happened sometime in the fall of 1973. Because even a small inconsistency like that, VA might pick up on and find either credibility issues with the veteran or of the person who's submitting the buddy lay statement. So you can kind of one thing to keep in mind is that we might be asking, or the veteran might be asking for information of an individual, information about something that happened decades ago. So it makes sense that there might be some minor inconsistencies with something as specific as the date, but to avoid it becoming an issue with VA, you can keep it more general. So you can just say in 1973 this happened, or in the summer of 1973 this happened. That way you avoid it being too specific and running the risk of having that potential inconsistency. And the other thing I think that's important to keep in mind too is to never exaggerate or downplay a condition or anything that you as the veteran or a buddy who's providing a letter to VA is providing in the information, in the letter. It's always just important to be as honest as possible. And then hopefully it decreases the risks of there being any issues with the information provided in the buddy letter. So with that said, let's assume you take all of those steps and VA still finds an issue with the credibility of the buddy letter that's been submitted. What are some things the veteran can do to overcome that, Rachel?
So the answer is potentially another lay statement. You can use the lay statement also for the purpose of offering clarification. So you can explain away the inconsistencies and offer some context for why the prior statements might be inconsistent with the record. Whether you took those additional steps that Courtney mentioned, or if by chance you didn't, you committed to a date that you weren't entirely sure of, you can offer clarification of that later. For example, when claiming TDIU, the total disability based on individual unemployability, VA often asks for a lot of employment history. And if that history is remote, decades ago, it's hard, and it's understandable that it would be hard to remember the exact details to provide to VA. So it's good to use all of those tips that Courtney gave out of the gate to offer some more general dates, or just explaining that it's really based on the best of your memory, but it could be an approximation. So yes, you want to try to clarify that information for VA if they make a negative credibility determination. You also want to explain how the person writing the letter has the personal knowledge necessary to discuss what they're talking about. So really reinforcing their competency.
Nick, do you have any additional thoughts on that as well, in terms of, where procedurally in a case is the lack of credibility finding typically made in a VA case, and what veterans can do in response to that?
Sure. So one of the problems our veterans that we represent often run into is the fact that the regional office usually isn't the one making credibility findings. Rating decisions, statements of the case, so on and so forth, tend to stick to the medical evidence primarily. And it usually falls to the board to sort of parse the particulars of competency and credibility. So oftentimes we run into situations where a veteran doesn't necessarily know that the credibility of their statements and their buddy statements is at issue until it's too late. So there could be a case where the board just issues a board decision outright with a negative credibility finding, and the veteran never really had the opportunity to explain why their statements were credible because they didn't know it was a problem. Another common thing we tend to see is a situation where the board gets the case, they review the statements, and then they remand for a VA exam to consider the statements. Now, recent case law, Miller versus Wilkie, says that if the board doesn't make an outright negative credibility determination, then there's sort of an implicit understanding that they found the statements credible. So in those situations, if they then get a VA exam that doesn't consider the statements or rejects the statements because for whatever reason, the VA examiner doesn't trust that they're credible, the board needs to call the examiner on it. They need to make sure that they're considering these statements as credible. And down the road, if the board attempts to overturn or otherwise revise its earlier implicit credibility finding, they need to give the veteran the opportunity to respond per the recent Smith versus Wilkie precedent. Oftentimes the board might not do it because it's a relatively new idea that they need to give the veteran the ability to respond. So it's something that veterans should keep in mind and be proactive about when they can. You can always request a copy of your VA exam, and if you see any issues with how the examiner treated your lay statements, you should point them out. You should also consider reaching out to a legal representative if you're unrepresented, because these issues can get complicated quick, especially if you end up needing to file an appeal with the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims if the board ultimately denies your case based off of that negative credibility finding.
And Nick, just to confirm, when you say board, you're referring to the Board of Veterans Appeals.
Yes, sorry.
I think we've covered a lot of really great information today. Do you, Rachel or Nick, have any final thoughts on this topic that you want to share?
The only thing I'd add is just to reinforce how powerful a tool providing a lay statement can be. With VA's improved decision notice, it would be a good idea just to take a look at that decision if they're denying a benefit that you're seeking, whether it's service connection or an increased rating, and see if one of the reasons that they are denying it is one of the things that we talked about today: corroboration of a stressor, lack of documentation of an in-service injury or event, or even a gap in treatment records, and see if a lay statement could serve you well to fill that gap and support one of the elements needed for service connection or an increased rating.
I agree. I think that's a really great point. Nick, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, the gap filling that Rachel mentioned is especially important, and it's important when talking about this sort of interplay between lay statements and medical evidence, because generally speaking, there might not be medical evidence to corroborate every symptom or every report of symptoms that a veteran has. And VA can't rely on the absence of like corroborative medical evidence to find a veteran not credible. If everything else is silent, then the veteran's lay statements regarding their symptoms, how long they've experienced them, so on and so forth, as well as buddy statements along those same lines, really is the only credible evidence regarding symptoms during those gaps that the board can consider.
Thank you both so much for providing all of this information today. I just want to remind the viewers as well that you can find more in-depth information on a variety of veterans topics on our blog, on our website, cck-law.com, and in our YouTube videos. And I'd encourage you to keep up with us on our Facebook page, our Instagram page, and our Twitter page. Thank you again, Rachel and Nick. Have a great afternoon.